maybe we can move on to the next speaker, Professor Matthew Ehret, if Professor Greer agrees to it. Meanwhile, once he joins back, Professor Chaudhary, we'll have him as the next speaker, or perhaps the last speaker.
Very happy to introduce Professor Ehret. Professor Ehret is from the American University in Moscow and is a senior fellow there, but has particular expertise in education and intercultural dialogue, which is incredibly fitting for this presentation today. I know he's speaking on behalf of Professor Edward Lozansky, who's the president of that university in Moscow, but we look forward to hearing Professor Ehret's talk now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the honor of speaking at this esteemed event. And as well, on behalf of Edward Lozansky, I myself am as you've mentioned, a senior fellow of the American University and also a director of the Rising Tide Foundation. Just listening to the last several presentations, especially Dr. Yoshiro and Dr. Gandhi, has been really enlightening and uplifting. So I was very much impressed by the quality of understanding of spirit behind the idea of what a true education system could be, and the challenge as well of encouraging, of creating students who are global citizens who are not so focused always just on knowing, but also on knowing what you don't know, which is always the greatest challenge, to appreciate how much it is about the complexity of this universe that we don't know. And that reminded me a little bit of a quote I put together while people were speaking, a few slides, which I'm going to share. It brought to mind a quote by an esteemed physicist named Dr. Max Planck, who revolutionized science a century ago by discovering the quantum world. And he wrote in 1935 that science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature. And that is because in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of nature, and therefore part of the mystery that we are trying to solve. Music and art are, to an extent, also attempts to solve or at least express that mystery. But to my mind, the more we progress in either, the more we are brought into harmony with all of nature itself. And that is one of the great services of science to the individual. And I just thought that this was such a beautiful statement coming at a time, and this is the philosophy of physics essay that he wrote, when there was a major battle over what path science would take. Would it be enslaved to a new type of school of mathematical thinking where scientists were expected to allow mathematical models to define how their minds were allowed to move? Or would science proceed on the path that Max Planck, Albert Einstein, Madame Curie, and many others who revolutionized science actually were taking, which was allowing the mind to lead in the dance of math and physics and actually move in and explore the creative nature of this universe, which demands that mathematics follow and evolve in accordance with our discoveries, our eurekas that we then share to our fellow human beings. And again, the beauty of this is that, just like Tagore would say as well, that science driven by the spirit and art and poetry driven by the spirit brings us into something which is common to all people, regardless of our cultures. We find that we have certain common qualities, universal constants, both physics. In the physical world, we all need water, we all need food, we all are aware of our mortality, and we are aware that our children, grandchildren are going to leave lives after us. And the question is thus posed to human beings, unlike other forms of species in nature, which simply sort of live in accordance with their biological or environmental conditions. What is our life about? What am I going to shape? What will I shape my identity around? And how will I use this gift of time that I have? So in an education system, I think we always have to think about those things about like, what is it that we ourselves are as educators? What are we trying to awaken in the hearts and minds of students? And the idea of this concept of the harmonization of our species to the universe, which may not be defined by purely mathematical processes, binary, processes. This is a very important thing, which brings me to several quick slides, and I'll try to go through this as fast as I can. But we are at the end of a system, and I mean, this is somewhat scary in some ways, somewhat exciting in other ways. There's a lot of opportunity and a lot of danger when the consequences of bad ideas, I think, begin to be felt. And just like a branch can be pressured to a certain point over time, at a certain point that pressure builds up a tension where a snap will happen. And I think when you apply human systems, which are defined by concepts, we're a concept-driven species after all, and when those concepts are out of alignment, out of tune with the law of humanity and the nature and the universe, the consequences are at a certain point, something will break. We've seen civilizations littered throughout history that have collapsed, which we're not able to return to or recognize the flawed ideas, and they just doubled down on the bad ideas. So today we are now at a place where people do have to think about systems. We have to think about the harmony of different cultures and nations and peoples of the world. There's 8 billion of us. We obviously live in a system on an Earth that's spinning around a sun. The sun is spinning around a galactic center that revolves approximately, I'm told, every 240 million years to do one revolution. There's a lot of complexity going on there. And the question is, how do we define the system? Do we think of the Earth as a closed system with all of the mechanics that drive weather, that drive everything located within the Earth itself? Or do we situate it as an open system that's evolving in accordance with magnetic fields, with an ocean of plasma and cosmic radiation constantly flowing through our biosphere and interfacing with everything else that's going on? So I think as students are concerned, if we're going to, teach students how to pose questions about what is the answer to such questions, I think it's good to just have the two different contrasting possibilities in our mind, because it's a hypothesis, which one we choose to go with. And if we do the open system view, there's a few characteristics of that. One is that it is a non-zero sum system. The system of the Earth thus would be, or any system would be thus defined by more than the sum of its parts, that there's something more to me as a person than my bodily cells and atoms, but there's something even higher, and that would be the same thing for any type of system that's open system. The whole, like I said, you'd have a relative limit to growth. So as we saw 500 million years ago with the Precambrian, there was a very low level potential for biospheric activity, not a lot of life, a lot of hostility to life in the universe. And today we have a much more complex, rich flow of carbon, of other forms of life through the biosystem. So the question is, what was the process of constraints, of limits that had to be overcome by the creation of new biotechnologies? Chlorophyll had to come onto the scene to take something which was a pollutant and a dangerous thing, like oxygen, and turn oxygen into something useful, because oxygen would kill previous forms of life. So this question of this creative flow of the universe, is the universe a rigid system of cold laws, or is there evidence of a creative momentum that allows us to both meet limits, that creates limits, but also overcomes limits to allow for a greater propagation of life? Win-win, if you apply it to human society, there would be a focus on looking for what is it that brings us in common? Where do we find win-win cooperation on an economic or political level? Again, from a human society, you would think of it as multipolar, that you'd have dialogue and discussion amongst different cultures and nations constantly. You wouldn't necessarily have one center of command telling the system what to do. The closed system view would be the very opposite. In many ways, you'd have it, it's basically an idea of a zero-sum Hobbesian system. The parts make up the whole. There's an absolute limit to growth in that sense, because everything that exists is all that could exist in that type of mathematical system. There's nothing new outside of the system that one could necessarily believe in. So you would thus be more focused upon managing the diminishing returns over time in that type of world. This is what I think John Stuart Mill referred to as the dismal science of Malthus, the dismal science of economics. Because really, what's the point of, where's the morality? Where's the creativity? Where's the love? It doesn't exist. It's purely a hyper-materialistic approach, which does unfortunately make one conclude, as Malthus did, that there isn't enough space on the earth for new babies at a certain point, and that one has to manage the population, as unfortunately the British had done in terrible ways to Ireland and to India throughout the 19th century, as a calculated policy governed by an enlightened elite, unfortunately, which is a very, very hubristic and egotistical way of thinking. There's a big win-lose competition focus. So the idea is, if the pie is only so big and people all have aspirations for abundance and meeting their needs, there's only so much to go around, and thus the strongest is the fittest, who will be able to gobble up the pie as much as possible. And there's a tendency towards unipolarism. Some might call it it's been given different names. Rules-based international order has been something I've seen bandied about. But the idea that you can't really trust people, you can't trust cultures and nations who will normally naturally be greedy and fight amongst themselves. You need to have something above the system to tell the system how to behave scientifically. I think I only have about 3 minutes here, but just to say, so I wanted to just get across these two different conceptions. The world that we live in right now, obviously, like I said, the crisis is being faced by an overflooding of monetary flows. Derivative markets in the West have grown to obscene proportions of $1.2 quadrillion, I've been told, in conservative numbers, which is well over 20 times or so the global GDP. And the physical economy has been breaking down. I live in Canada, where our infrastructure is unfortunately 50, 60 years or older in some cases for water management systems, which we stopped building and we stopped maintaining or improving upon back in the late 60s, early 70s, because we were told now we're a consumer society. We don't have to have industry anymore. We don't have to produce those things. We don't have to maintain those things we used to. And so we don't have any high-speed rail. We're talking about maybe building in the next 10 years some standard gauge rail, which is the same technology we had 40, 50 years ago. And here we have in Asia, we have a burst across Japan, China, India. We have an embrace towards developing high speed, even magnetic levitation rail, 30,000 kilometers in China. India is looking at this massively. We've got projects for opening up the Arctic, where India has great investments working in harmony with Russia and South Korea and Japan in opening up the Arctic, which again is going to cut 10 days off of the flow of trade from Asia to Europe. We've got rail corridors flowing all over east to west that is potentially transformative in terms of creating infrastructure, science, long-term investments to reconstruct the areas of the world that we've destroyed. We have discussions towards even building up the Bering Strait, which the Russians had offered even back in 2007 to the West, to build together in order to avoid tension, avoid war, to work together on building up the type of resources and rail, which has not been done, to bring together countries in win-win cooperation. This has been rejected. Today's the anniversary of John F. Kennedy's murder, who was a friend of international development and an enemy of empire. He was in discussion here with the Canadian Prime Minister in the 60s around the idea of Arctic science cities fueled by next generation energy sources. That's one example of something that was commissioned in Frobisher Bay, Nunavut, for both, it was a really pioneering idea. But that's been all gone. After John F. Kennedy was killed and his brother, there's been a loss of this type of spirit of long-term thinking, 10, 20, 30-year projects. That was all left to the wayside. And we were told, like I said, consumerism is the new norm. The Middle East, again, if you look at the international north-south transportation corridor from Russia to India through Iran, which would bring in many offshoot corridors, 18 countries have signed on. This is transformative if it is not sabotaged. It's a very synergistic with the Belt and Road, and it would bring in countries into a new way of thinking of, again, seeing money and seeing mathematics as a servant of the longer, higher needs of the people, not just for momentary profits. The win-lose zero-sum system obviously has produced a lot of destruction. These are just some before and after shots of some countries we have helped with humanitarian bombings. This is some examples of what's being discussed currently around the reconstruction of Syria with high-speed rail, industrial corridors, energy sectors being built up that would completely transform the cultures and create trust and hope again, which is ultimately why you do infrastructure. It's not to make money. Some other examples towards Syria more directly, now that there's rail being built between Iraq and Iran, which could continuously move all the way through Iraq into Syria to create a new corridor into Lebanon as well for ports into the Mediterranean. And again, greening deserts, right? If we want to know the system, if the system itself is defined by an idea of creative growth and overcoming limits, maybe the deserts that used to be green, like the Sahara 5,000 years ago, was green. We don't know what caused it to become a desert, but we know that there's a lot of abundant water underneath. We know that there's a lot of potential to use nuclear desalination, other forms to desalinate water. And when we look at just recently, NASA, this is the last slide, produced some surprising effects by evaluating the biodiversity or the biomass on the Earth, which has increased enormously, largely because of the two countries who are accused of being the worst enemies of nature, the big polluters India and China, who are constantly in the Western media, which I watch a lot, unfortunately, where they're constantly being demonized. But these countries, through their reforestation programs, water projects, and also general, I think, intention to uplift people out of poverty, using a different way of thinking about sustained development, they've actually been able to increase biomass in the greatest rates of all countries of the world. So that's just something which I find opens the door to more questions than answers in some ways. And it definitely, I think, for students who will be encouraged to be the global leaders of the future and to be sensitive to the morality, the love of humanity, the love of discovery, there's certain concepts that I think here that have a lot of value in an education system. So I just wanted to end it with that.
Thank you very much. You took us on an amazing journey there, not just across the Arctic, but from Max Planck and the mystery of nature through to JFK and Arctic cities. So that was very thought-provoking indeed. I do agree that we have to stimulate the curiosity in our students and get them to think about systems. And it was interesting to explore the philosophy that you expounded with regards to open and closed systems. You also highlighted the growing inequalities and the need for us to bring the world closer together, developing new frontiers, whether it's in the Arctic or by rail, and to start reconstruction, not just of the damage, but reconstruction of opportunities of countries to work together to create that collaboration that avoids conflict. That was a very profound contribution, and we're eternally grateful to you for making it to this exciting conference. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.